Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and move way beyond those basic photography rules of thumb you've probably heard 1,000 times by now. We're going to uncover the actual, frankly fascinating optical physics behind your camera's depth of field. I mean, think about it. How often have you been out in the field, confidently dialed in your settings, squinted at the back of your camera's tiny LCD screen and thought, yep, absolutely nailed the focus, right? But then you get home, pull the image up on a big monitor, zoom in, and eeks. Your supposedly crisp landscape is just kind of mushy. Well, if you've ever wondered why your images look soft when they really shouldn't, or why simply stopping down your aperture doesn't just magically guarantee a sharper photo, you're in the right place. We're going straight to the source material today to decode the fundamental science of sharpness.
So, here's our game plan for today. First, we'll look at the circle of confusion. Second, the limits of acceptable sharpness. Third, we'll tackle the threat of diffraction. Fourth, we'll cover lenses and camera formats. And finally, finding that all-important optimum F number.
All right, Section 1, the circle of confusion, and defining exactly what sharpness is. To build our foundation here, we have to start with a realization that honestly might just blow your mind a little bit. A camera doesn't actually capture deep planes of perfect focus. What we perceive as depth of field is really just a beautifully constructed optical illusion. You see, a camera lens can only precisely focus on one single exact plane. Imagine it as a razor-thin sheet of glass hanging in the air right in front of your camera. Anything resting exactly on that glass, perfectly sharp. But any object standing even slightly in front of or behind that specific plane is rendered by the lens as an expanding disk, a blur spot, essentially, not a perfect point of light. So that coveted depth of field we all chase, it's just the visual zone on either side of that invisible glass plane where those blur spots remain smaller than our acceptable circle of confusion. If the blur spot is tiny enough, our brain is completely fooled into thinking it's a perfect point.
Now, the exact size of what makes an acceptable circle of confusion isn't some universal constant. It actually relies entirely on three very human, very environmental factors. First up is human visual acuity. This is basically just how well our eyes resolve tiny details, kind of like reading that Snellen eye chart at the optometrist. Standard calculations usually assume a healthy eye can resolve about 9 distinct line pairs per millimeter. Second, we have viewing distance. If you press your nose right up against a print, obviously it's going to look blurry. Stand across the room, and it looks sharp. So standard calculations assume a comfortable viewing distance of about 250 millimeters or roughly 10 inches. And third is image enlargement. This is exactly how much you have to blow up the original image captured on your sensor to make your final physical print. It's a moving target, completely dependent on how you decide to present your final work.
Let's put that into perspective. Because an image taken on a 35mm negative needs roughly an 8 times enlargement just to make a standard 8x10 print, its tiny blur spots are magnified way more than those on a massive 4x5 large format negative. To compensate for having to blow up that smaller original image, a 35mm sensor actually requires a much stricter baseline for sharpness, meaning a much smaller acceptable circle of confusion. This right here is the exact reason why a shot that looks tack sharp on your tiny digital camera screen turns into a blurry disappointment when you finally try to print it out for your living room wall. You enlarge the image, and by doing so, you enlarge those blur spots until that optical illusion of sharpness just completely fell apart.
Moving right along to Section 2, limits of acceptable sharpness and visualizing the physics. This brings us to how light actually, geometrically, creates this effect inside your lens. Think of U as the physical distance from your camera out to your subject, and V as the precise distance inside the camera from the lens to the digital sensor. Light travels from the subject and converges into these geometric cones inside the lens housing. Now, whenever the cross-section of these intersecting light cones remains smaller than our acceptable circle of confusion, which we mathematically call C, boom, we achieve our acceptable depth of field. But the very second that cone widens past C, that blur spot becomes glaringly visible to the human eye and the whole image goes noticeably soft.
Understanding this geometry unlocks a pretty legendary concept in photography, the hyperfocal distance. By mathematical design, if you calculate and lock your focus point exactly to the hyperfocal distance for your specific lens and aperture, your depth of field magically extends from exactly half that distance all the way out to infinity. Imagine you're standing on a dramatic cliffside at sunset. You want those delicate wildflowers right at your feet to be incredibly sharp, but you also need the distant, jagged mountain peaks 10 miles away to be just as crisp. By calculating the hyperfocal distance based on your circle of confusion, you place your razor-thin focus plane in the exact mathematical spot that allows both the flowers and the mountains to live within that acceptable blur zone. It is literally the ultimate cheat code for landscape photographers.
All right, Section 3, the threat of diffraction, otherwise known as the antagonist of our story.
We have to introduce the physical villain of this explainer now because, as we all know, in optics there's no such thing as a free lunch. Just as you might be sitting there thinking, oh, I'll just simply close my aperture to shrink those geometric light cones and reduce my blur spots forever, we hit the ultimate photographer's tug of war. Yes, defocus blur decreases as we increase our f number, but simultaneously, diffraction blur aggressively increases. To really understand diffraction, picture ocean waves squeezing through a very narrow gap in a stone breakwater. As the waves pass through that tiny opening, they bend, they spread out, they ripple in all directions. Light waves do the exact same thing as they pass by the edge of your tight aperture blades. As that hole gets smaller, the light waves interfere with each other, creating what physicists call an airy pattern, these alternating dark and light rings that degrade and soften the entire image. Stop down too far, and this physical bending of light actually destroys the very sharpness you were trying so hard to gain.
This tug of war brings us to a wonderfully simple mathematical rule of thumb derived from the Rayleigh criterion. 1500 divided by your f number gives you your absolute diffraction-limited resolving power in line pairs per millimeter. This is the absolute physical ceiling of your lens's sharpness. Listen, no matter how ridiculously expensive or theoretically perfect your glass is, the unbending laws of physics simply won't let you resolve more detail than this equation allows. It's an immovable barrier.
And this perfectly explains a really crushing irony for a lot of beginners. Attempting to get extreme depth of field on a small 35mm sensor by cranking your aperture way down to f32 to maximize your focus zone, it will actually ruin your image quality. You think you're adding sharpness, but physics dictates you're actively destroying it. The diffraction blur spot becomes massive relative to that tiny sensor size. This is precisely why 35mm lenses hit their maximum sharpness sweet spot around f8 to f11, while large format lenses, which remember don't require nearly as much enlargement for the final print, can get away with stopping down much further and are typically sharpest around f16 to f22.
Section 4. Lenses and camera formats. Let's look at the variables.
So when we swap out those standard symmetrical lenses for more complex asymmetrical designs, like a big telephoto lens, the traditional depth of field rules get completely warped. Unlike symmetrical lenses, a telephoto's entrance and exit pupils differ drastically in size. Think of it like looking through a funnel from the wide end versus the narrow end. It fundamentally changes how the light spreads and eventually strikes the sensor. Because of this pupillary magnification factor, an internal focusing telephoto macro lens can actually yield up to 75% greater depth of field than a standard symmetrical lens at a 1-to-1 magnification ratio. Those differing pupils alter the angle of the light cones entirely. It's pretty wild. And this leads us to the ultimate format trade-off out there in the field. Let's say you want the exact same framing and depth of field on a large 4x5 camera as you have on your standard 35mm setup. Well, because of the longer focal length required on the large format just to get that same composition, you'd have to stop down to f32. Now, to let enough light in at f32, your shutter speed drops drastically, from a crisp 1/250th of a second on the small camera, all the way down to a dangerously slow 1/15th of a second on the large format. At 1/15th of a second out in the wild, the slightest breeze rustling the leaves or the tiniest vibration of your tripod will completely obliterate all that sharpness you just did all that math to achieve. Finally, Section 5, Finding the Optimum F Number, our grand resolution. So how do we actually win this battle? We've got defocus blur pushing us to stop down and diffraction blur screaming at us to open up. Well, the answer involves a major paradigm shift, courtesy of a mathematician named Hans Mass. He calculated that your absolute sharpest possible overall image is not achieved by stopping down endlessly into the diffraction zone, nor is it achieved by shooting completely wide open. The sharpest result happens exactly when you find the F number where these two competing blurs perfectly balance each other out. It's the ultimate optical compromise. When defocus and diffraction contribute equally, the total blur spot hits its absolute mathematical minimum. Hans Mass developed a root-square formula combining the two. But hey, don't panic. You absolutely do not need to memorize heavy algebra to be a great photographer. The real peace of mind here comes from simply understanding the profound principle it represents. For any given focus spread on your camera, there is a mathematically proven optimal sweet spot for your aperture that delivers maximum resolving power. You don't have to guess anymore. The physics have already provided the answer for you.
Armed with the physics of the circle of confusion, the absolute limits of the human eye, and the ever-present threat of diffraction, you are now fully equipped to take complete control of the light entering your lens. The next time you're out in the field trying to get a landscape perfectly sharp from the front all the way to the back, I want you to ask yourself, are you just crossing your fingers and guessing, or are you commanding the physics of sharpness?